In this lesson, we take a look at using dependency injection. The objectives for this lesson are to find out what is dependency injection, why use dependency injection, how the service container works in ASP.NET, the service lifetimes, and then of course we're going to do a bunch of demonstrations of dependency injection. Now, dependency injection means that ASP.NET is creating a service container. And this is a structure that is used to hold the service instances, these classes that we use for dependency injection. So you register the classes you want to use through dependency injection, and .NET will create those instances of the objects for you. They'll then insert them into your minimal APIs as parameters. This is what's called an inversion of control design pattern, where the APIs don't create the objects that they need to perform their work. The objects are given to them. So the service container contains a collection of services: a logger service, a configuration service, a data service, security, diagnostics, and probably many others as well. So what happens is the dependency injection engine looks at the API that you're using, the app.map.get, and it looks into your parameter list of the function and says, oh, hey, they are requesting a logger service. So it creates an instance of it, or grabs an instance, and it injects it into your call for you automatically. Then maybe the logger service might go into yet another API, a different one, and maybe it also has the security service and the data service that are going into that as well. But we don't create the instances of them. ASP.NET does. So why do we use dependency injection? Well, code reusability. It makes our applications easier to test and maintain. It reduces the coupling between classes. A big one is it reuses objects that have already been created. This reduces the instantiation time every time a new route gets called, because it's just grabbing an object that's already been created and it's just living in that service container. It also allows you to inject a different object. Think about this for a minute. You have a configuration object in the service container. Generally, there's an interface that goes with that. So you're really just passing an interface. Well, the configuration object one time could be getting data from the JSON file, but then the next time it could be getting something from a database table. All you have to do is swap out the implementation of the configuration object with where do you want to get the data? A JSON, database table, XML file. Same thing with a database object. Right? If you get a database object, you could be getting data from tables, from cloud storage, from memory, XML files, JSON files, just by swapping out the implementation. Nothing changes in your app.map.get function. You're not having to rewrite each one of those. You're just sending it a different implementation of a database object or a configuration object. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons why we like to use dependency injection. When you put a service into the service container, they can have different lifetimes. They can be a singleton, which it's created the first time they are requested, and then always the same instance to all the other app.map.get routes. So basically, we use this for configuration settings, database objects, anything that doesn't change throughout the life of the program. We then have a scoped lifetime. This is created once per client request. If a client comes in and requests some sort of object, then that object is going to be used in that map get. But the same object, even if more than one API calls another, it's going to be the same object. It's then destroyed at the end of the client request. So if one API calls another API, we use the same object all the way through. That's scoped. We use this for data that needs to stay around, regardless of how many methods the call goes through. Now, another service lifetime is what's called transient. This is created literally each time they are requested. Even if it goes from one method to another method or to a different service, it's always going to be a new instance of that object. And it's finally destroyed when that one block is finished. So when that one method finishes, if it goes to another method, then that new method gets a new instance. It's destroyed at the end of that block. And then finally it's destroyed in the block that it got called from. You're not going to use these too much, but they are there. We really only use these when we need data to be different between each method or service, etc. That is not something that happens a lot. You'll typically use singleton and scoped. To illustrate this, let's create a settings class that we can then follow through this instantiation process. Go over to your Entity Layer folder and add a class called AdventureWorks API Defaults. Now you're going to put into this class, it's going to be under the namespace AdventureWorks API.EntityLayer. We're going to create a constructor, and we're going to create 3 properties. Created, so we want to see the date and time that this actually was created. Then we're going to have a product category ID and a product model ID. For now, we're going to add more to this a little bit later. So now that we have that created, let's go over to the program.cs, and right under here, under the add and configure services, we're going to do builder.services.add_scoped. Now, typically you do 2 parameters here. One would be the interface, and then one would be the actual concrete implementation of that. We only have one because we're just doing settings. We don't really need an interface. So we're just going to use them both the same here. What this does is this adds that class as a scoped lifetime to the services collection. Now let's add a new settings API. So let's go down here to where all of our routes are. And let's add a new guy here. I'll break this onto a couple lines so we can see it. So now you can see here that the second parameter, which is our function, we're saying AdventureWorks API Defaults, and we called it settings. So that says go out to the service container, have it inject that instance of that, and return it with the results.OK. Let's go ahead and run this. We now have a new group, settings, so let's do a get on this, try it out, and let's execute. Now, if you look at the response body down here, you can see the created is the date and time that this object was created, and you see the hard-coded data from the constructor, product category ID 1, product model ID 2. To illustrate the scoped lifetime, we're going to use that same settings class in 2 API calls, and we're going to look for the differences. Add another API settings, but call it settings 2. Not very inventive, but there you go. So we now have 2 API endpoints. They're both accepting the AdventureWorks API default. So let's go ahead and run each one. So we'll take a look at the first one here. We try it out. We execute. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this right here. So I want you to notice the created. So this is when I'm recording this. And you see the timestamp there, 10:34:58. 10:34:58. And then like 798, 99, 935, whatever. So there's that one. Let's now go down here to the API settings 2. Let's execute this. And now when we look at this guy, you can see the difference. Notice the created down here. Look at the date timestamp. It's 10:35, not 10:34. So it's a separate instance each time one of those APIs were called because we did it as scoped. Let's now take that same class, but let's inject it now as a singleton. So change this from add scoped to add singleton. That's all we're going to do. Let's now run this. And again, we're going to execute each one of the settings here. So now you can see the created there. Let's now do the try it out here on do the execute there. And now if you look at the created times, they are exactly the same because there's only now a single instance. It's created the first time somebody requests that. And then after that, that one instance is kept in the service container. It doesn't create a new one each time. It's now the exact same instance. So that's the difference between scoped and a singleton. Now, a simple settings class, it just has properties in it and doesn't really do anything. Doesn't call for an interface, but one of the things I mentioned was we should use an interface when we're using dependency injection. What that does, it allows you to switch the implementation you pass to classes. So like service 1 gets data from a hard-coded class. Service 2 gets data from a database. Service 3 gets data from an XML file. So the best thing is the API itself, right, that function in which we're using this class does not know which of the above services is passed to it. It doesn't really care because you're going to have an interface that defines something like get data. And we know that each one of these services, 1, 2, and 3, are all going to implement get data. They're all just going to get the data from a different location. So let's take a look at using interfaces with dependency injection. Go up to your project, right mouse click and choose Add New Folder. And we're going to create a new folder called Interfaces. And we're going to add a class called iRepository. Okay, so even though it says class, we're going to change this to an interface here. So namespace is AdventureWorks API.interfaces. The public interface, iRepository T. So this is a generic interface. We have a list of T get, and we have a T get passing in an int ID. Well, what does that look like? Yeah, you're right. It looks like that product repository class we created earlier where we had a get method and we have the get ID method. So what we're going to do is we're going to implement this interface on all of our repository classes. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to do a using on the AdventureWorks API.interfaces. Then I can do an iRepository product. So I'm saying this interface is being implemented because I have a get method and a get ID, and the T over here is represented by product right here. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and build this, make sure we've done everything correct. Excellent. Let's go back to program. And now we're going to do builder.services dot add, and we're going to do scoped here. And I'm going to do iRepository, and we'll do product. Okay. Now, it didn't have it, but when I hit tab there, it put the using statement up there on line 3, which was kind of cool. And then I'm going to put the product repository. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I was mentioning that you should have a interface as the first parameter going into the add scoped or add singleton, and then the concrete implementation as the second. Now later on, we're going to change that product repository so that it's not using the hard-coded data. It's going to be getting that data from an entity framework. Now that we've created that, we can now come down to where we're doing our mapping. And we can say, hey, you know what? Here on the first one where I'm getting the single one, I'm passing in an ID, but I also want to pass in an iRepository product, and I'm going to call, product, uppercase, and I'm going to call it repo. So now, instead of having to do a new product repository, remember dependency injection is creating the instance of that from the concrete product repository. So now all I need to do is do repo.get. I'm going to take this same line of code here, and I'm going to copy it down here to the other one where we're getting the list of products. So I'm going to still have it injected into this as well. And I'm going to use repo here now, right? So the variable that the injection is being inserted into is repo. So what happens is dependency injection in ASP.NET looks up the interface, looks up the first one and says, oh, great, that's matching up to something that I have. What's the concrete implementation? Oh, it's a product repository. Creates an instance of it, passes it to each of my APIs here so that I can now run. And if I've done everything correctly, we should get the exact same results we did, but now I've kind of removed class dependencies here. I'm now telling it, hey, you know what? I don't know where I'm getting the data. All I know, if I pass something that's valid, like a 760, I should get back a response here. Now we can see this in the response body. We get back a single product. And if we run the other one with the list, we try it out and we execute. See, it takes a long time, so it's getting all of that data. And we see the data down here in the response body. So there we go. We've now used dependency injection by creating an interface and adding it to our services container. In this lesson, we learned that dependency injection inserts objects into our APIs for us automatically. It also reduces class dependencies. We want to use scoped and singleton service lifetimes most often, And we always want to be using interfaces with dependency injection. Coming up next, organize your APIs using router classes.